An angry refusal of a refund echoes across the bustling harbor town as a merchant shouts off-screen. A small brown-haired boy demands to know why he is being denied a refund for clearly spoiled goods. The vendor claims the fish are aged sashimi, but the boy points out the rot and a dog urinating on the crates. Brian, the young butler, holds out his hand and sternly demands his money back while he is still asking nicely. The vendor yells that the boy is the one damaging the merchandise as a scuffle sends crates and a dog flying. A dark silhouetted figure with glowing eyes looms over the merchant, ordering him to compensate the person he is arguing with. Recognizing the imposing figure, the terrified vendor stammers out a respectful address to the nobleman. The merchant tries to tell the boy to pay up, but a cold refusal comes from the shadow. A blonde-haired man in a decorated military uniform steps forward, repeating the command for the vendor to pay compensation. The vendor is paralyzed with fear, wondering why he must pay and who this powerful man is. Brian stands small and nervous before the tall officer as a group of sailors watches the confrontation. The officer grabs Brian by the vest, declaring that he has found the person he was looking for. Brian looks up in surprise as the blonde man pulls him close with a firm grip. The boy adopts a smug expression, confirming that he is indeed a professional butler. A decorative panel emphasizes his role and identity as a butler. A girl with long brown hair sprints through the dense, dark forest in a desperate escape. Fearing for her life, she realizes she must vanish before she is caught and sold like property. The girl, revealed to be a noblewoman, sits amidst flowers with a look of profound sadness. A man orders her to pack her belongings, reminding her that her family title is now meaningless. Her cousin, Fabian, pushes up his glasses as he gloats about stripping her of everything she owned. Brienne protests that he has already seized her family's wealth and noble title. Fabian cruelly reveals he has sold La Brienne Hautain Lafayette to Viscount Ferrand for 200 gold coins. The girl cowers in terror at the thought of the greedy and monstrous Viscount Varenne. Fabian casually mentions a detail about the Viscount's first wife as he prepares to leave. He smiles maliciously, explaining that the previous wife was beaten to death after trying to run away. Brienne stares at her reflection in the moonlit water, realizing she has no choice but to hide. With a sharp blade, she begins to cut away her long brown hair to discard her past identity. She watches the locks of hair fall, convinced that this is the only way to remain hidden from her pursuers. The scene shifts to the massive and fortified Castle Connorlit. Disguised as a boy, Brienne arrives at the outskirts of the castle where she hopes to find refuge. She reads a recruitment flyer for a butler at the castle, noting the high weekly wage of 2 gold. A carriage travels down a winding road as she heads toward her high-stakes job interview. An older passenger questions why she would go to Castle Connort, but she insists the pay makes it worthwhile. The man warns her of the Duke's terrifying reputation, asking if she truly knows who she is visiting. He describes the Duke as a legendary commander and war demon who decimated entire pirate fleets. The man paints a picture of a brutal killing machine and a crazy warmonger with no mercy. A quote from the Duke suggests he views war as a collection of evils where a swift end is the only virtue. The passenger leans in to whisper a final, unsettling secret to the visibly shaken Brienne. A notification reveals that the Duke apparently harbors a deep-seated hatred for women. Brienne trembles under the weight of her secret, knowing her true identity would mean certain death. She clenches her fists and prepares to face the interview despite her intense fear. The blonde Duke, known as Captain Kane, sits at his desk with a formidable and stern presence. Brian sits in the interview chair, terrified that any slip-up will lead to his execution. Panicked, the girl decides that the safest course of action is to fail the interview on purpose. The Duke reviews the resume and asks Brian V about his previous professional experience. Brian attempts to sabotage the interview by claiming to be naturally lazy and prone to slacking off. He falls backward out of the chair in a display of incompetence, which the Duke finds surprisingly honest. When the Duke lists his impressive language and math skills, Brian frantically admits that the entire resume is a lie. He shouts that he is incompetent and irresponsible, begging the Duke to fail him and let him go. The older butler smiles warmly, assuming the boy's outburst is simply a sign of how desperate he is for the job. The elderly butler, Jurno, smiles warmly as he commends Brian for being a remarkably honest young man. Terrified, Brian begs the butler not to reveal his secrets and wonders if they are only keeping him because he was the sole applicant. A shower of confetti erupts alongside a notification confirming that the boy is officially hired, causing him to collapse in shock. Jurno explains that the staff are all retired soldiers, while Brian privately vows to run away as soon as he finds an opportunity. The boy's eyes bulge and his mouth hangs open as the butler mentions that his wages will double once the probation period ends.
Transformed by greed, the boy adopts an adorable, dog-like persona with dollar signs in his eyes, eagerly asking where to begin his work. Durno pleasantly informs him that his first duty is to attend to the Duke's bath, leaving the boy completely bewildered. Clutching a sponge and towel, the disguised noblewoman laments her sudden transition from a baron's daughter to a man's bath attendant.
A nervous sweat breaks out on the boy's face as he enters the steamy bathroom and sees the Duke sitting in the tub. The steamy atmosphere emphasizes the Duke's powerful and muscular physique as he relaxes in the warm water. With a sharp startle, the boy shouts in a high-pitched voice after the Duke stoically commands him to begin the task. Brian begins to hesitantly scrub the Duke's broad shoulders, his expression a mix of extreme discomfort and focus. A close-up shows the yellow sponge gliding over the Duke's wet skin as a soft sound of scrubbing fills the air.
The boy is momentarily surprised, thinking to himself that the man's skin is much softer than he had initially expected.
To maintain his sanity, the boy tries to mentally distance himself from the reality of the intimate situation.
He visualizes himself as a tiny chef wrapping blocks of cheese, pretending that the Duke's back is merely a firm dairy product.
Brian repeats his assumed name in his mind, desperately trying to anchor himself to his new, false identity. Nervousness continues to overwhelm the boy as he tries to keep his eyes focused and his hands steady. The Duke suddenly questions where the boy thinks he is touching, catching him completely off guard. A wave of intense panic washes over Brian, his face turning a deep shade of purple as his heart races.
Turning around with a stern look, the Duke tells the boy to stop what he is doing immediately.
The Duke admits that it is becoming increasingly difficult to hold back, leaving the boy wide-eyed and stunned by the statement.
Bubbles and flowers decorate a close-up of hands submerged in the soapy water during the tense moment.
Letting out a deafening "ah, ah, ah" scream, Brian sprints away from the tub in a total state of hysteria.
Squeezing his sponges in frustration, the blushing boy demands to know exactly what it was that the Duke couldn't hold back.
With a bewildered and slightly pained expression, the Duke explains that the boy was simply scrubbing him much too hard. An explosion of sound effects accompanies Brian's tantrum as he rants about the Duke being a grown man who should wash himself.
The boy stands up and defiantly declares that he cannot do this anymore, prompting the Duke to ask for a reason. Brian protests that even the highest Imperial nobles are capable of washing their own bodies in private.
The Duke points out the physical impossibility of reaching his own back, staring at the boy with a flat, confused look.
Chibi versions of the duo appear as Brian asks how he managed before, and the Duke admits he ended the war just to come home and bathe.
The boy is horrified to realize that the legendary war demon ended a massive conflict early just for personal hygiene. A dramatic flashback reminds the reader of the Duke's previous quote about a swift end being the only virtue in war. A satirical recruitment poster features the Duke promising world peace in exchange for help washing his back.
Brian takes a long cloth and demonstrates a simple technique for scrubbing one's own back without assistance. The boy is utterly exhausted by the realization that he is teaching a powerful military commander the basics of bathing. The Duke is genuinely impressed by the towel method, while Brian thinks that even a goldfish would have figured it out. Looking incredibly satisfied and pure, the Duke happily tests the flexibility of a sponge in the flowery atmosphere.
As the boy trudges away, his footsteps sound out a weary rhythm while he reflects on how draining his very first task was. Rubbing his forehead in frustration, the boy stands in the hallway trying to recover his composure after the ordeal.
A sudden, sharp realization hits the boy as he senses a group of people approaching him from behind. 3 massive, intimidating figures loom over the small boy, their eyes glowing with an unsettling, shadowed energy. Brian freezes in terror, his heart sinking as he wonders why these 3 burly men are surrounding him. The orange-haired man looming over the boy asks if he is indeed the new apprentice butler at the castle.
A dark-haired man leans in with a mischievous grin, commenting on how remarkably cute the new recruit looks.
The men crowd in and begin pinching the boy's cheek, marveling at how his skin is as soft and white as milk cake.
Screaming at the top of his lungs, Brian begs the scary giants to stay away and stop touching him. The 3 men adopt cheerful, friendly expressions and express their genuine desire to be friends with the new boy.
The orange-haired man introduces himself as Boggy alongside Dronin, both of whom serve as attendants at the castle.
Brian nervously introduces himself, while the giants continue to gush over how small and pale he is compared to them. Brian protests as Boggy compares him to a rabbit he just ate for breakfast.
A sly grin spreads across Dronin's face as he notes the appearance of a new cutie.
Stuttering in fear, the boy is overwhelmed as mischievous snickering fills the air around him.
With a quick gust of air, Brian suddenly sprints away to handle the first task alone. Brian rants about the total lack of normality within the castle walls. He finds one normal thing, his room.
The boy rolls happily across the mattress.
He admires the room's top-tier ocean view.
Brian notes his new quarters are 10 times larger than his previous home. He curses Fabian for previously banishing him to a cramped maid's room for chores. Sitting on the bed, he realizes the high pay and huge room make the job worthwhile. He resolves to endure for 2 years. A low, rumbling hum fills the library as the Duke watches the boy the next day.
The blonde Duke sits with crossed arms, radiating a stern and formidable presence. Brian worries the Duke is glaring at him for making a mistake on the paperwork. The boy wonders why the man keeps staring at him while he works. The Duke finds the boy's appearance cute. A light, repetitive scratching sounds as the Duke admires Brian's nimble writing fingers. Blushing deeply, the Duke wonders why such strange thoughts are suddenly crossing his mind. A sharp, sudden grunt from the Duke prompts Brian to ask why he was summoned. Brian suggests buying fruit for the castle's reserves, confusing the Duke with the specific request. The boy explains that dried fruits are essential for preventing scurvy during long maritime voyages. The Duke asks if he knows sailors, and Brian nervously confirms that he bets.
Brian recalls growing up under a naval officer grandfather, making him well-versed in maritime matters.
The Duke argues that long voyages are currently unnecessary since trade routes are cut off.
Brian counters by asking about upcoming plans to open trade with the Kingdom of Nicerdan.
He points out that reaching Nicerdan requires passing through pirate territory, necessitating the specific supplies. The Duke stares with intense interest. He wonders where this smart child originated. The Duke finds the boy both cute and smart. The Duke puts Brian in charge of the purchase and organization task.
He hands Brian a large golden key. Brian hesitates, feeling it is too early to be trusted with the warehouse key.
The Duke dismisses his humble protests. With a terrifying expression, the Duke declares that Brian has been hired for life. A heavy, metallic clatter sounds as the scene shifts to a dusty, cluttered warehouse. With a strained, rhythmic grunt, the boy begins the difficult task of moving heavy crates.
Journo notes Brian's efficiency as the boy questions how anyone could find anything in such a mess.
Journo maintains a pleasant smile while claiming that the cluttered room is actually quite organized.
Brian is horrified by the mess. A rapid whistling sound accompanies Brian's cleaning frenzy as he questions how the castle functions. Journo praises the hard work and suggests heading to the food storage warehouse next. Exhausted, Brian is shocked by the news.
Deep, labored gasps escape the boy as he struggles to climb the castle stairs. A faint, rhythmic rattling sound emphasizes his trembling as he wonders why he gets no breaks.
A cold, sudden breeze chills Brian as he worries he has landed on his superior's bad side.
He sighs at his current misfortune.
He suddenly spots his room ahead. Brian celebrates reaching his one and only place of refuge and resting sanctuary.
A sharp, sudden click sounds as he bursts inside, eager to remove his disguise and sleep.
Entering his room, Brian is greeted by the trio of giants celebrating his completed work. The men cheerily welcome him, revealing they have been waiting with a celebratory feast of pizza and wine.
Brian dryly decides he has entered the wrong room and attempts a quick exit.
Dronin pulls the boy back into the room, reminding him that this is indeed his own quarters.
The other two men join in, enthusiastically encouraging the new recruit not to be so shy.
Brian collapses onto the floor, questioning why they are partying in his room while he is dying of exhaustion. Brian grumbles that personal closeness has absolutely no impact on their professional duties. The three giants stare at him with overwhelming, sparkly eyes while offering up their snacks and drinks. Brian reluctantly agrees to stay as long as they remain quiet, which the men quickly promise to do.
A sudden, forceful chug follows as Dronin tips a bottle of wine directly into the boy's mouth with a messy pff.
Brian panics internally, realizing he has only ever experienced light sips of alcohol before this aggressive chugging.
A splash of wine hits his head as the boy's face turns a bright, drunken shade of pink.
A sharp, heavy thud sounds as the wine bottle is slammed down onto the floor. Slurring his words, a very intoxicated Brian demands to know why they have given him such a ridiculous nickname. The men explain the nickname while pinching his cheeks, much to the boy's mounting annoyance. Boggy marvels at the boy's smooth skin and small stature, ignoring Brian's protests about being touched. A sudden collective gasp fills the air as the men begin to suspect that their new companion might actually be a woman. Brian's heart hammers against his chest as he stutters out a desperate denial of the men's growing suspicions. The giants loom over him with mischievous, shadowed faces, jokingly suggesting they check his identity by removing his clothes. Brian trembles as a large hand reaches out, his voice a mere whisper as he begs them to stop. Exploding in a fit of rage, Brian violently pummels the three giants and sends them flying with a heavy thud and a pained ugh.
Brian rants at the fallen men, threatening them with a bizarrely aggressive fate if they ever call him cute again.
Screaming at the top of his lungs, the boy makes it absolutely clear that any physical contact is strictly forbidden.
A low, terrifying voice cuts through the chaos as the Duke stares through the doorway with a murderous intensity. The Duke demands to know if the men have been touching the boy, appearing like a vengeful demon in the doorway.
With a chilling, icy stare, the Duke repeats his question, demanding to know if anyone has laid a hand on his apprentice.
Fearing the Duke's wrath, Brian quickly tries to de-escalate the situation by claiming the men were just trying to be friendly. The Duke remains unmoved, sternly declaring that any unwanted physical contact is a serious form of harassment.
The three men hang their heads in deep shame as the Duke expresses his profound disappointment in their behavior. A heavy silence falls over the room as the Duke turns his attention back toward the startled boy.
Brian is horrified to learn that his rest is over as the Duke informs him that there is still more work to be done. The Duke stands in a serene, flowery atmosphere, looking significantly more relaxed than he did moments ago. Brian laments his endless list of chores, realizing his next task involves removing a stray dog from the premises.
After being urged to hurry, Brian quickly promises to return once he has finished the new assignment.
Dronin tentatively asks the Duke if it is wise to send the small boy to handle the task by himself.
The Duke is caught off guard when Dronin mentions that the boy will likely be shocked by what he finds.
Dronin warns that the situation is highly unusual and could lead to a significant misunderstanding on Brian's part.
The scene shifts back to the doorway where the three men stand waiting, wondering about the Duke's next move.
Brian confidently declares that a simple stray dog is nothing to fear and that he will handle it easily.
Armed with a sausage stolen from the kitchen, the boy prepares to lure the animal away with a tasty treat.
A soft creak sounds as Brian tentatively peeks into a dark room, calling out for the mysterious puppy.
A sudden voice questions the mention of a puppy, catching the boy completely by surprise.
Brian freezes as he spots a pair of legs resting in the air on a lavish, rose-covered bed.
An upside-down, red-haired woman stares back at him, asking if she is the puppy he was looking for.
Stunned into silence, Brian stares at the beautiful woman and wonders exactly what kind of situation he has walked into.
The woman dryly notes that she isn't hungry, questioning why the boy is offering her a sausage. Looking around frantically, Brian asks where the stray dog is, only for the woman to ask him what dog he means.
The woman introduces herself as Ellet, claiming that she is the only one present in the room. Brian is horrified, realizing the Duke referred to this woman as a dog and confirming rumors that he is a severe woman hater. Ellet excitedly leans in to inspect the new face, correctly guessing that he is the castle's new apprentice butler.
A low, rhythmic thump sounds as a pair of boots walk down the hallway, a voice asking if working under Ulrich is truly hellish.
A sharp, sudden click sounds as Ulrich bursts into the room, startling Brian while the red-haired woman casually acknowledges the Duke's arrival.
A soft, rhythmic squeeze follows as the woman takes Brian's hands in hers, thinking to herself how much she truly likes the boy.
A heavy, weary sigh escapes the Duke as he watches the scene with mounting frustration.
With a low, terrifying voice, Ulrich warns the woman that he will throw her out if she dares to return one more time.
A rapid, whistling sound accompanies the Duke suddenly hoisting the woman over his shoulder, much to Brian's absolute shock.
A sharp, heavy slap sounds as Ulrich slams his hand against the window frame while the woman desperately begs him to wait and listen.
A sudden, forceful whoosh follows as the Duke ruthlessly hurls the red-haired woman right out of the high castle window. Long, piercing screams fill the air as the woman tumbles through the open sky in a state of pure terror.
A final, distant scream echoes back as Ulrich calmly steps away from the ledge, leaving Brian trembling in the middle of the room. A light, repetitive potting sounds as the Duke brushes off his hands, leaving a horrified Brian barely able to stutter out a question. Frozen in place, Brian's mind races as he questions if his superior truly just threw a woman out of a window.
A soft, rhythmic chatter fills the air as the scene shifts to a bustling, sun-drenched coastal market filled with fishermen.
Shaking with a visible tremor, Brian hides under a cloak and laments the fact that the woman has run away.
Recalling the woman's terrifying fall, Brian worries about his own safety under such a violent master. Watching a fish hang from a gantry, Brian becomes convinced he will die if he stays at the castle. Brian recalls leaving a resignation letter on the Duke's desk, planning a desperate escape to the Southern Empire. Spotting a bounty board, Brian overhears two men discussing a 2 gold reward for a specific target.
Brian's heart hammers against his chest as he sees a wanted poster of a woman who looks exactly like himself, realizing it is his own portrait.
Terrified, Brian pulls his hood low and wonders how Viscount Varenne could have possibly obtained a portrait of him.
A sudden heavy realization hits as Brian recognizes the work of Fabian and his extensive web of connections.
Standing before a world map, Brian acknowledges that Fabian's influence reaches into many illegitimate and dangerous places.
Realizing he has no easy escape, Brian determines that he needs to find a place to hide completely.
The boy searches for a refuge where Fabian's vast network will never be able to reach him.
Looking toward the horizon, Brian spots the formidable silhouette of Castle Connart rising above the trees.
Brian's eyes widen as he realizes the massive castle is the only place strong enough to serve as his fortress.
A slow, rhythmic trudge follows as Brian makes the long, defeated walk back toward the castle gates.
A faint, rhythmic shivering sounds as a tearful Brian laments his inevitable return to the place he just tried to flee.
A sharp, heavy clatter sounds as Brian's attention is caught by an approaching carriage on the dirt road.
Brian is shocked to see the official carriage belonging to the Duke of Connart passing by.
A long, high-pitched screech sounds as the ornate carriage grinds to a sudden and purposeful halt right in front of the boy.
A soft, rhythmic beckoning follows as a single finger emerges from the carriage window, silently commanding Brian to approach.
Trembling, Brian begs for a moment to mentally prepare himself while the person inside the carriage remains ominously silent.
A soft, heavy creak sounds as the carriage door swings wide, revealing the dark interior waiting for the boy.
A sharp, sudden shing follows as a sword is thrust out of the carriage, prompting Brian to scramble inside in a total panic.
A low, rhythmic clatter sounds as the carriage begins to move, with Brian sitting stiffly across from a silent, blonde man.
Ulrich reveals a note from the dog, which is actually a survival message and a formal invitation from the woman he threw out. Confused, Brian asks if they are visiting her now, privately wondering why his own resignation letter wasn't mentioned.
A sudden, messy puff follows as Brian chokes on his own air when Ulrich reveals he already saw the resignation letter. The scene shifts to a grand estate where a line of maids stands ready to receive the arriving carriage.
With a soft, rhythmic bowing, the maids offer a polite and formal welcome to the estate.
A slow, rhythmic step follows as Brian enters the mansion, noting that the staff treats the butler with more respect than the Duke. A rapid whistling sound accompanies a maid dragging Brian along, noting that the Duke has no intention of following them inside.
A soft, rhythmic splash sounds as Brian is led to a fountain where a man's hand rests, calling out the boy's name.
A handsome, red-haired man greets Brian with a cheerful smile, thanking him for accepting the invitation to visit. Brian is completely confused and asks if they have met, while the man notes this is their first time meeting in this form. Posing dramatically, the man reminds Brian that they actually just met the previous day.
Brian stares in absolute, wide-eyed silence as the impossibility of the situation begins to sink in.
A sudden, playful wink follows as the man reveals he is the same person as the red-haired woman, leaving Brian screaming in confusion. Introducing himself as Lars Ellet Lidre Connart, the man reveals his titles as a naval captain and a loyal servant of the Duke.
Brian is stunned to hear Lars compare the two as an. Lars explains that his name actually means dog in an ancient language.
Brian stares in absolute, judgment-filled silence.
Brian notes that being a knight explains how Lars survived the fall, while Lars insists his appearance belies his strength. Lars proudly explains how he caught branches to avoid injury, while a skeptical Brian wonders why he's so boastful. Lars notes that the boy has a surprisingly high tolerance for the absurd. Lars asks if he is seen as strange, and Brian immediately confirms that he definitely is.
Brian tries to hide his laughter after Lars admits that he knows he isn't normal himself.
A close-up of a teacup accompanies Lars, noting that Brian is speaking to him quite naturally now. Lars claims Brian is the first person to treat him normally since the Duke.
Brian looks at a portrait of the Duke and realizes that Ulrich doesn't actually hate Lars.
Lars admits he was worried that being thrown out of a window would create a bad first impression.
Brian listens quietly as the captain continues his explanation. A carriage waits patiently under a blooming garden trellis. A sharp, sudden click sounds as Brian rejoins the Duke inside the carriage, surprising the blonde man. Brian holds out a paper bag and asks his master if he has eaten it.
Ulrich rejects the estate's food for being too sweet, while Brian notes the Duke's picky appetite.
Brian offers a piece of plain bread he saved, suggesting it might suit the Duke's tastes better.
A soft, rhythmic tearing sounds as Ulrich takes the bread, insisting the castle has plenty of food.
Ulrich eats the bread and admits his habit of hoarding leftovers comes from growing up in poverty. Ulrich clears his throat awkwardly as a blush creeps onto his face.
The Duke tries to regain his composure while Brian watches him closely. Brian notices the Duke's eyes twitching and realizes his stoic master is actually quite flustered. A small smile plays on Brian's lips as he watches his superior. Brian addresses the Duke with a serious tone. Brian cautiously brings up the subject of Captain Elliot's very unusual personal preferences. Ulrich closes his eyes and dismisses the topic as the captain's own private business.
The Duke explains that everyone has the freedom to decide whether or not to share their secrets.
Brian asks if the Duke is truly comfortable being the target of rumors and misunderstandings. Ulrich firmly declares that what others think of him has no impact on his personal honor.
Brian is mesmerized by the Duke's unshakable confidence and resolve.
A soft, rhythmic clenching sounds as Brian grips his pants, preparing to ask one more difficult question.
Brian bluntly asks why the Duke sent a severed head to a woman named LaClaudia.
Brian recalls the image of a noblewoman and asks why such a gruesome gift was sent to a suitor. Brian asks why the Duke would send such a gift to a woman who proposed to him.
Ulrich remains silent and unmoved as the conversation shifts toward his violent past actions.
A cold, piercing blue eye stares back as the atmosphere turns chillingly serious. A dark gift box drips with a mysterious pink fluid as the Duke mentions his family traditions. Brian thinks back to when the woman was just a young lady from a minor family. LaClaudia, daughter of the Prime Minister, is shown hoping for a marriage proposal from the Duke. Ulrich sent a formal reply in a gift box to the woman following his family's customs. A sharp, heavy clatter sounds as LaClaudia eagerly opens the lid of the mysterious package.
A piercing, blood-curdling scream sounds as the woman discovers the severed head of an enemy commander inside.
Brian notes that the sight caused every other noblewoman in the room to faint in terror. Brian realizes he was the only one left standing simply because no one was there to catch him. Ulrich nonchalantly explains that the gesture is a long-standing tradition of the Connert family.
The Duke cites the family commandments, explaining that gifting a severed head is a test of a spouse's courage.
Brian dryly points out that most normal families do not have such horrifying traditions.
Brian laments the total lack of proper child-rearing in the Duke's family as the carriage moves on. Both the Duke and his apprentice settle back into their seats to face a mountain of daunting paperwork.
Reporting to the office daily, Brian notes he has learned several interesting things about the Duke. A soft, rhythmic topping sounds as the Duke touches his nose whenever he enjoys his tea.
A sharp, rhythmic clicking sounds as Ulrich snaps his fingers whenever he feels concerned.
Brian observes that the Duke habitually crosses his legs whenever he encounters a difficult problem.
A rapid rhythmic clicking follows as the Duke stares at his paperwork, appearing visibly troubled.
A soft, heavy sigh sounds as Brian steps forward to offer a pink magazine to his master. Ulrich looks up in confusion as Brian presents a specific page for his review.
Brian suggests using the popular magazine to choose a gift for the Duke's relative, Princess Isabel.
The Duke is surprised Brian noticed his dilemma, but the boy explains his knowledge of Imperial celebrations.
Brian admits he is constantly monitoring his master's moods, and Ulrich finds the suggestion helpful.
A soft, rhythmic fluttering sounds as the Duke flips through the magazine looking for a choice.
Pointing to a specific item, the Duke commands his apprentice to place the order immediately.
Brian is horrified to see the Duke has selected a simple infant's rattle as a gift. The boy clarifies that the princess is starting school this year and is far too old for toys. Ulrich admits he assumed she was still a baby simply because of her small stature. Brian dryly mocks the Duke's logic, noting that few people in the Empire would be considered adults then. The Duke praises Brian's hidden expertise in selecting appropriate gifts for noblewomen. Brian boastfully claims he can at least tell the difference between basic clothing fabrics like sheer and lace. Ulrich stares back in total, blank-eyed confusion at the mention of the different materials. A sudden, thunderous shout follows as the Duke orders the boy to get back to his actual work. A slow, rhythmic trudging sounds as the Duke walks through the castle, overhearing a conversation below. The Duke stops as he hears someone mentioning the legendary ship known as the Sea Seed.
Ulrich looks down to find Brian chatting with a former helmsman near the founder.
Excitedly, Brian asks the old man for technical details regarding the warship's unique cannon barrels.
The Duke watches from above, surprised by his apprentice's deep fascination with military vessels.
The man explains that the ship utilized advanced technology from the 3 Western nations. Brian is amazed to learn that magic circles are used to prevent the cannons from exploding during use. The boy exclaims that such a fast and heavily armed ship must be practically invincible. The sailor corrects him, noting that the Sea Seed actually sank to the bottom years ago. Brian eagerly asks about the current fastest ship, admitting he has always wanted to ride it.
Ulrich looms silently behind the boy, startling him and ending the casual conversation.
The Duke gives a stern, glowing command for Brian to follow him immediately. Brian looks up with a start, confused by his master's sudden appearance and intense mood. A sudden, quick dash follows as the sailors scramble away to avoid the Duke's legendary temper. A soft, rhythmic rushing sounds as the scene shifts to the bright, open sky. Brian gasps in delight as he realizes where his master has led him. A loud, rhythmic splashing sounds as a jubilant Brian runs toward the shoreline of the ocean.
The boy stands on the sand, marveling at the incredible and vast expanse of the water.
Ulrich stands stoically behind him, noting that the sea's size is simply its natural state. Brian admires the deep blue color, comparing the water to a sky that has melted into the sea. The Duke offers a clinical explanation, stating the water is only blue because it reflects the sky. Pointing at the waves, Brian poetically compares the white sea foam to delicate lace on the ocean floor. Ulrich dismisses the beauty, crudely comparing the foam to the residue of poorly fermented ale. Brian is visibly annoyed by the Duke's complete lack of imagination and romanticism.
The boy sighs, acknowledging that someone in the Navy would naturally think of beer first.
Ulrich orders the boy to keep moving, revealing that the sea itself wasn't the main attraction.
Brian freezes in shock as he catches sight of something incredible in the harbor.
A massive, majestic warship sits docked in the water, glowing under the bright sun. Brian asks in a hushed tone if the ship is the famous Enigma Blanc.
A sudden, bright shimmering follows as Brian's eyes sparkle with excitement at seeing the legendary vessel.
Brian explains the Enigma workshop built the ship over 8 years with a ratio ensuring superior maneuverability.
Brian notes how spacing the masts solved stability issues, prompting Ulrich to realize the boy loves weaponry.
Brian geeks out over wave corrosion and scratches, while Ulrich identifies potential weaknesses he can exploit.
Ulrich asks if Brian still wishes to ride on the fastest vessel in the world.
The Duke points toward the harbor and identifies the ship as the fastest one. Brian stares in stunned silence as he processes his master's incredible revelation.
The boy asks in disbelief if the ship he is seeing is the one.
Ulrich describes his custom patrol boat, Ark, which utilizes fuel to move automatically without oars. The Duke explains the machine requires no human power, yet produces far superior results.
Brian claims the Duke has expanded the boundaries of the world, much to Ulrich's confusion.
Brian realizes that without the need for human endurance, they can travel significantly further. Narrative text speaks of venturing beyond 99 mountain peaks into the unknown. The journey continues past the horizon once guarded by the legendary Dark Goddess.
Exploration reaches toward the frozen north and the vast expanses of the south.
Brian looks up with a radiant smile, completely inspired by the Duke's technological marvel.
Ulrich watches his apprentice closely, his piercing blue eye reflecting a quiet, contemplative mood.
Brian turns to his master and asks if they are leaving immediately.
Ulrich commands their departure as a startled Brian rushes to keep up with him.
The boy worries he might have accidentally said something wrong to upset his master. Ulrich stops and holds his hand out toward his young apprentice. The Duke stands tall as he offers his hand to the boy in a rare gesture. Their hands hover in the air as Brian hesitates to take the offer. Brian blushes deeply, realizing this is the first time he has held hands with another man. A sharp, heavy crunching sounds as Ulrich grips Brian's hand with an unexpectedly crushing skeletal strength. Brian's face contorts in agonizing shock as the Duke's grip proves to be incredibly painful.
Brian realizes a hand meant only for weapons wouldn't be gentle, while Ulrich looks on confused.
Ulrich stares ahead with a smug expression, claiming he is deeply moved by the moment. Brian notes his surprise that a man of high status can steer a ship personally.
Ulrich explains that naval battles require leaders to take the helm if their helmsman falls.
Brian realizes with concern that the Duke doesn't even consider the possibility of his own death. A narrator asks if the Duke's nature is one of reckless arrogance or justified confidence. A soft, rhythmic snapping sounds as the blue and white sails catch the ocean wind. A loud, rhythmic rushing sounds as the ship's hull cuts smoothly through the bright blue water.
Brian closes his eyes and enjoys the sensation of the sea spray against his face.
Brian turns to the Duke and declares that his master is truly a magnificent person.
Ulrich begins to offer his thanks as he continues to steer the ship with focus.
The Duke stands firm at the wheel, looking every bit the experienced naval commander. Mesmerized, Brian watches his master's stoic profile as they sail across the open water. The wind ruffles Brian's hair and clothes as he remains in a state of awe. Ulrich notices the sudden silence and asks Brian why he stopped speaking in mid-sentence. Brian bows deeply, thanking the Duke for fulfilling his wish to ride the fastest ship. Ulrich tells the boy that talking to common sailors won't give him any real knowledge. The Duke tells Brian to stop wasting time and only ask the person who knows best.
Brian looks bewildered, wondering why he is being scolded for something he didn't realize was wrong.
Brian salutes his master, promising to correct his behavior and focus only on the Duke's lessons. Ulrich notes that Brian has a good attitude, appearing satisfied with the boy's quick obedience. Ulrich asks if Brian feels dizzy or nauseous, but the boy insists he is having fun.
Ulrich realizes Brian possesses a natural naval constitution, making him perfectly suited for the sea.
A child's storybook tells a tale of a merman king destroying kingdoms with powerful howitzers.
A young Brian sits on a relative's lap, listening to maritime legends with wide, wondering eyes.
Brian fondly recalls calling out to a grandfather figure.
A stern man with glasses insists that girls are too weak for naval life.
Brian joyfully declares possessing a natural constitution perfectly suited for sea travel.
Their ship rests peacefully near a lush, sun-drenched tropical shoreline.
A soft, rhythmic splashing sounds as feet wade through the crystal-clear water. Running across the sand, Brian laughs while complaining about the water's surprising coldness. Ulrich points out Brian's exceptionally thin ankles, questioning if he suffers from malnutrition.
The Duke predicts his apprentice would immediately become defensive if he voiced his concerns.
Ulrich imagines a furious Brian shouting that his ankles are actually quite sturdy.
A quiet, satisfied chuckle escapes the Duke as he enjoys his own private joke.
Brian suddenly cries out, causing Ulrich to rush over and ask what happened.
Wincing in pain, Brian explains that stepping on gravel barefoot was a painful mistake. A sudden, quick whoosh follows as Brian is caught off guard by a swift movement. Ulrich effortlessly hoists Brian onto his shoulder to keep him off the rough ground.
Startled and disoriented, Brian demands to know why his master is suddenly carrying him.
Ulrich calmly insists this method is more efficient, though Brian continues to protest.
Brian struggles against the Duke's grip, arguing that he is capable of self-care.
The boy continues to flail, commanding the Duke to set him down immediately. Ulrich asks why Brian is being difficult, while Brian claims the position is humiliating.
Brian panics internally, fearing that such close contact will reveal the secret of her gender. A soft, rhythmic thudding sounds as Ulrich places Brian back down on a solid rock.
Kneeling before his apprentice, Ulrich offers a sincere apology for wounding the boy's pride. The Duke asks for Brian's full name, catching the boy completely off guard.
Brian's eye widens in sheer terror as the weight of the question sets him.
Ulrich reasons that no ordinary commoner would know the princess's background by heart.
A heavy, expectant silence falls as the two stare at each other on the beach.
The Duke remains motionless, his gaze piercing as he waits for a truthful answer.
Brian realizes with dread that her status as an undercover employee has been exposed. The boy wonders if the Duke truly doesn't care about his hidden identity. Ulrich clarifies that he values Brian's exceptional abilities more than his mysterious background. Brian looks at his master in disbelief, stunned by the unexpected show of respect. Brian realizes with relief that the Duke hasn't discovered the truth about her being a woman.
Fidgeting nervously, Brian admits to being born of the nobility before family tragedy struck. When asked about the title, Brian explains that a cousin inherited the family's rank.
Brian suppresses the anger of knowing the title was actually stolen from her. The conversation turns to the family's lack of assets and their dire financial state.
Looking away sadly, Brian laments that eventually her body was her only remaining asset.
Brian suggests the tragic conclusion is obvious, while Ulrich watches with a grim expression.
The Duke admits he doesn't understand, prompting a look of frustration from the boy.
A sudden, sharp clinking sounds as Brian imagines the coins of a slave trade. Losing his temper, Brian shouts that the final step was being sold into servitude. Brian mocks the Duke's lack of insight regarding the fate of destitute noble children.
Ulrich looks completely bewildered, as if he has just realized his own denseness.
Brian sighs deeply, thumping his chest in frustration over the difficult explanation.
A soft, heavy warmth follows as Ulrich places a comforting hand on Brian's head. Ulrich reflects on the dark reality of fallen nobles being sold to wealthy merchants. The Duke's hand remains resting gently on Brian's hair in a rare moment of empathy. Brian looks down, moved by the sudden and gentle physical contact from his master.
Ulrich questions why Brian didn't choose a path focused solely on accumulating wealth.
The Duke concludes that personal values among the Imperial nobility must vary greatly.
Brian clears his throat with a smug, self-important expression. A quiet, knowing smile plays on the Duke's lips.
Ulrich kneels before his sitting apprentice, maintaining their intense connection on the beach. A soft, rhythmic washing sounds as the turquoise waves lap against the shore.
Looking down at the Duke's belt, Brian asks about the ornate sword. The golden hilt of the magnificent weapon glints brightly in the tropical sun.
Brian's eyes sparkle with pure wonder as he gazes at the legendary blade. Handing the weapon over, Ulrich grants the boy permission to touch it twice. Brian asks if the Duke fears being attacked, but Ulrich promises an award for any successful strike.
A soft, rhythmic snickering sounds as Brian smiles, finally holding the weapon he admired.
Ulrich sits back and watches with detached curiosity as the boy stands with the blade.
A sharp, rhythmic ringing sounds as the polished steel is drawn from its scabbard.
Holding the sword high, Brian admires the balance and weight of the masterwork. With a sudden, focused intensity, the boy prepares to demonstrate his own skill.
A sudden, quick whoosh follows as the blade slices through the air. Brian lunges forward, his movements surprisingly fluid and trained for his size.
The air whistles as the sword cuts a sharp arc through the empty space.
A loud, rhythmic splashing sounds as sand flies up from Brian's aggressive footwork.
Ulrich leans on his hand, observing the display with a critical and unimpressed eye.
Brian finishes his sequence with a flourish, his gaze remaining fixed and determined.
Turning back to his master, the boy awaits a reaction to his swordsmanship.
Ulrich stares back, his expression unreadable and cold despite the boy's effort.
The Duke's lips curl into a smug, superior grin as he prepares to respond.
Ulrich notes that Brian clearly has some training, even as he moves to end the bout.
A sudden, sharp clicking sounds as the Duke reveals a small, ornate pistol. A loud, rhythmic bang sounds as Ulrich fires the weapon, sending a startled Brian tumbling.
Trembling on the ground, Brian asks what the device was, while Ulrich mocks his ignorance. The Duke explains the weapon is a modern gun, a standard tool for high-ranking generals. Ulrich poses triumphantly with the smoking firearm, proving the era of the sword is ending. The scene shifts to a somber, gray palace window overlooking a quiet garden.
Inside the dim room, an attendant announces the arrival of the third prince. A soft, rhythmic thudding sounds as expensive leather boots cross the stone floor.
Cavalier enters the chamber and asks the blonde man if he was summoned.
The blonde-haired man remains by the window, refusing to acknowledge Cavalier's presence.
Taking a seat, Cavalier notes he was summoned only to be ignored. The blonde man reveals that Duke Connart has sent an unexpected gift to Isabel. Cavalier smiles knowingly, noting the Duke's choice in gifts has improved since last time. The blonde man wonders how Cavalier obtained the letter the Duke sent the Emperor.
The blonde man realizes his uncle has finally succeeded in inventing the unmanned power engine.
A loud, rhythmic thumping sounds as the blonde man slams his fist on the table.
The blonde man is furious that his uncle finally succeeded in his goal.
He rants that expansion will make the empire look like a small country. He screams that the country he is meant to rule will effectively shrink.
Cavalier questions if the prince is upset about other nations emerging and reducing the empire's scale.
The prince orders Cavalier to Connart territory to spy on the engine and the Duke.
He specifically commands Cavalier to find out if the Duke has been meeting any women. Cavalier is visibly surprised by the sudden interest in the Duke's personal life. He muses that the Duke's soldiers wouldn't have thought to give jewelry as a gift. Cavalier asks if leaving the capital is wise, but the prince dismisses his political rivals. The prince calls him a mongrel, and Cavalier accepts the insult as a half-blooded royal. Derek promises to complete the task and return while the blonde prince tells him to leave immediately. A soft, rhythmic thudding sounds as Derek walks away through the palace hall.
Derek stretches his arms and yawns. Derek excitedly suggests meeting his cute uncle. Ulrich and Derek stare down in terror.
Ulrich notes he has never seen such an object before, while Brian watches them curiously from his desk. Ulrich remains puzzled by the item. Brian claims he needs to recalculate while Ulrich watches him work at the desk.
Ulrich notes the pen stopped moving and orders Brian to come over.
Brian laughs nervously and admits curiosity.
Ulrich shows Brian a shrine.
Ulrich explains the object was taken from pirates and shows Brian the detailed drawing of the device. Brian realizes something as Ulrich asks if he understands what the object represents. Brian asks for permission to go out and investigate the mystery further. Brian explains he has a specific place to check and only needs to confirm one detail. Ulrich leans over the desk as a confused Brian asks what he is doing.
Ulrich declares himself the most suitable person to protect Brian, much to the boy's frantic shock.
Brian desperately tells his master to wait. Brian argues that no noble would ever serve as a bodyguard for a mere deputy butler.
Ulrich dismisses the concern, claiming he can do what other nobles cannot.
Brian argues that the Duke's presence will hinder information gathering, then asks Derek to explain the situation.
Derek chuckles and notes that the Duke's innate dignity is far too prominent to be hidden.
Ulrich pensively considers that his own dignity might be the actual source of the problem.
The three men stand in silence. Ulrich relents and orders Brian to go with Dronin instead.
Ulrich threatens Brian against running away again, but the boy insists the castle is now his home.
Brian excitedly declares the beginning of a second act in his life.
A soft, rhythmic thudding sounds as Brian and Dronin walk through a damp city alleyway. Brian shrieks in terror as a large rat scurries past his feet.
Dronin mocks the boy's reaction, asking if he has really never seen a rat before.
Brian tearfully explains that his family was once wealthy enough to never deal with pests and that he cleaned thoroughly afterward.
Brian complains about the presence of rats in the ducal territory, suggesting the Duke prioritize pest control.
Dronin asks where the Duke would find the mental capacity for such things while maintaining his legendary title.
Brian argues that everyone suffers when rats are present, regardless of how powerful the ruler might be.
A soft rhythmic squeaking sounds as another rat watches them walk by.
Dronin is impressed by how quickly Brian understood the Duke's lack of interest in mundane matters.
Dronin gives a thumbs up, praising Brian's education while the boy hides his face in embarrassment.
Brian arrives at a stone building, identifying it as the fence's secret hideout.
Brian reaches for the handle, determined.
A sharp, rhythmic creaking sounds as the heavy door swings open to reveal a dark shop.
A man in a bandana looks up from the counter and guesses Brian is a merchant.
The fence wonders if Brian is a wealthy noble looking to sell something valuable.
Brian is surprised the man assumes he is wealthy or a nouveau riche noble. Brian smiles to himself, grateful for the helpful misunderstanding.
Brian pulls out a scroll and clarifies that he is actually there to buy something.
Brian presents the drawing to the fence and asks if he has ever seen the object. The fence looks Brian in the eye and asks how the boy knew to bring such a drawing.
A loud, rhythmic clinking sounds as Brian tosses a heavy bag of gold coins onto the counter.
The fence instantly becomes greedy and excited, confirming he has seen the item before.
Brian asks about the trade price, and the fence claims the gold is enough to buy 2 of the items.
Brian asks if the object is just a simple antique, but the bandana-wearing fence quickly dismisses the notion. The boy questions what the item actually is, causing the fence to stammer nervously in response.
The fence leans in and warns Brian to keep this information a secret, to which the boy impatiently agrees.
A soft, rhythmic whispering sounds as the fence reveals that the items originated from the 3 Western continent nations.
Brian lets out a shocked shout that echoes over the building as he processes the mention of the Western nations.
The fence scolds the boy for being so loud, and Brian quickly offers a sheepish apology for his outburst.
Looking determined, Brian realizes he is now certain about the dangerous nature of the item.
The scene focuses on the detailed drawing of the mysterious, ornate device.
Brian reflects that the patterns are used by Western royalty to manifest abilities, concluding that the pirates and those nations have likely formed a secret alliance. Brian asks if he can proceed with the purchase, and the fence gleefully agrees, expressing his appreciation for such understanding customers. The fence tells Brian to wait for the arrival of the goods, just as a dark figure suddenly bags the boy from behind.
A sudden quick whoosh follows as the fence promises to stay in contact while Brian is dragged away.
A loud, rhythmic thudding sounds as the scene shifts to a grand office where a blonde prince sits behind a desk.
Derek enters the chamber with a wide and confident smile on his face.
The blonde prince remains seated, observing his visitor with a stern and cold expression.
A guard demands respect for the prince, while Derek claims he only came to strengthen his relationship with his uncle.
The prince mocks Derek's smooth lying, addressing him directly as Duke Connard.
A sudden quick rustling sounds as the prince orders Roik to remove the noisy guards from the room.
A loud, rhythmic thwacking sounds as Roik punches the protesting guard in the face.
A loud, rhythmic thudding sounds as the guard collapses, and the prince asks about the fate of the other attendant. An elderly butler opens the door to another unconscious body and promises to handle him the same way. Derek maintains a mischievous, devil-like grin despite the violence occurring around him. The dark-haired man argues that bothersome companions shouldn't be brought along, but the prince insists on following royal protocol.
Derek notes that the knight seemed unusually busy on his way into the palace.
A loud, rhythmic scraping sounds as the prince stands and orders Derek to follow him immediately. The prince admits that Derek has a much better talent for finding people than he does. A sharp, quick gasping sounds as Brian suddenly jolts awake on a wooden floor. Looking around the dim storehouse filled with barrels and crates, the boy wonders about his location. Brian gasps in shock as a gruff voice asks if he is finally awake.
A loud, rhythmic thudding sounds as a pirate captain with an eye patch stares down at the captured boy. Brian realizes with frustration that the fence was actually an underling for the pirate leader.
Feeling a sharp headache, the boy deduces he was knocked unconscious and begins to worry about Dronin's safety. Brian is relieved to see a snoring Dronin tied up nearby, noting that neither of them appears to have broken bones. The pirate captain demands to know the origin of the drawing while Brian remains bound on the floor.
The boy defiantly suggests that they are both professionals and that protecting his source is a fundamental rule.
A loud, rhythmic snapping sounds as the captain reacts violently to the boy's refusal. A loud, rhythmic thudding sounds as Brian is kicked onto his back while the pirate orders him to answer correctly.
Brian groans in pain, clutching his stomach as he lies helpless before his captors.
Surrounded by the pirate crew, Brian realizes he needs a new strategy to survive the interrogation.
A soft rhythmic mumbling sounds as Brian begins a complex story about his grandfather from 25 years ago.
The captain shouts that the boy is telling nonsense and accuses him of trying to pull a scam. Brian frantically insists his story is true and that his grandfather was the one who originally obtained the item.
Internally, the boy knows he must stall for time, trusting that even the socially awkward Duke will eventually find him. A soft, rhythmic chattering sounds as Brian spins a tale about the Battle of Rosato and a legendary windless zone.
The scene shifts to the ruins of a town where Ulrich stands alongside Derek. Derek asks his uncle if he is feeling unwell, noticing a strange mood about the Duke.
Ulrich denies being sick, but the dark-haired man remains unconvinced by his master's demeanor.
A loud, rhythmic rumbling sounds as Ulrich surveys the destruction, wondering why any lord would ruin his own territory. A loud, rhythmic banging sounds as citizens scream for mercy while Derek sighs at the chaotic scene.
Derek reflects that leading the Duke to the mercenary office was the best way to gather information while preventing further damage. A merchant explains that the deputy butler headed to Fair Street looking for a fence.
The dark-haired man notes that the fence's house was found completely empty. Ulrich and the dark-haired man stand amidst ruins as screams for help echo.
The dark-haired man offers a palace butler since rescuing people is difficult.
The dark-haired man looks pensive.
Ulrich angrily insists he only wants Brian back, not a replacement butler.
The dark-haired man teases that Ulrich is earning a reputation as a tyrant. Broken wooden beams lay skyred. The dark-haired man explains that villains occupy the nice houses in such slums. Fair Street tax revenue is zero.
Ulrich questions how residents with no income afford multi-story buildings with windows.
The dark-haired man considers the point.
Narrative notes the knights targeted tall buildings while sparing the shabby ones.
Armed resistors were injured while women and children were treated with care.
The two men walk together.
A loud, angry voice screams insults at Ulrich, calling him a bastard.
Ulrich complains about the noise and orders their departure as insults continue. Insults call them crazy bastards.
The pirate captain threatens to kill Brian if any more steps are taken.
The pirate regrets wasting time talking to the boy instead of acting.
The dark-haired man identifies Brian as the kid they were searching for. Ulrich orders the pirate to disarm, claiming his blade outpaces sound itself.
A hand reaches out.
A sudden, sharp whoosh sounds as an object is moved through the air.
The pirate captain aims a revolver at Brian and challenges the Duke's speed.
The two men watch the captain. Brian realizes he should have been far more careful with his approach. The boy considers kicking the pirate but knows bullets are too fast. Brian looks toward the Duke.
Ulrich questions the pirate's identity and the man names himself Captain Asadok.
Ulrich wonders how a mere pirate obtained such an expensive handcrafted workshop revolver.
The Duke observes that the pirate is ignorant of the weapon's true value. Text boxes detail the handcrafted 6-shot revolver made by a master artisan.
The pirate and Brian look confused.
Ulrich babbles about technical components, confusing the pirate while Brian gasps in shock.
A diagram shows the rotating cylinder and the hammer that locks the mechanism.
The overview explains that the hammer must be cocked before the gun fires.
Failure leads to high misfire rates.
Ulrich reveals that the hammer on the pirate's gun is currently not cocked. Eyes of the Duke and boy.
A loud, sharp thwack sounds as Ulrich strikes with incredible speed.
Brian is tossed to safety.
A sudden, sharp whoosh sounds as the pirate realizes his weapon is missing.
Captain Asadok stands stunned.
Ulrich catches Brian and pulls him close to his chest.
The Duke protectively cradles the boy's head in a warm embrace.
A sharp, quick, metallic clicking sounds as Ulrich aims the confiscated revolver.
A heavy, rhythmic thudding sounds as the scene reaches its climax. Brian addresses the Duke respectfully. Ulrich decides to head back. The blonde prince looks on with a calm but calculating expression.
Brian lets out a bewildered gasp as he questions the situation.
Holding a letter, the man notes that according to Ciarn, Duke Connard is currently unattached to any woman.
Fabian observes that the Duke's new deputy butler appears to be significantly improving his master's aesthetic tastes.
Fabian questions whether the information in the letter can truly be believed at face value.
The blonde prince asserts that there is no reason to doubt the honesty of the third prince's correspondence.
The prince asks Fabian to explain the reasoning behind his skepticism. Explaining the situation, the prince notes that the third prince values Princess Becca above all else and won't act recklessly while she is within their reach.
The prince notes that Fabian is being particularly cunning today while the dark-haired man enjoys his tea. Expressing his appreciation, the prince says this is why he likes his companion, though Fabian claims he just knows how to address royal concerns.
Fabian points out the harsh reality that the prince has not yet officially been named the heir to the throne. Consumed by rage, the prince screams about the necessity of congressional approval and wonders why his father won't convene them, fearing the emperor favors Connart. A haunting image of the duke with his blade appears as the prince's eye twitches with jealousy and fear.
Fabian casually sips his tea, remarking that the emperor's hesitation is understandable since Duke Connart is the first in line.
The blonde prince slumps in his chair, cursing his current predicament in a state of deep frustration. Fabian notes with a smirk that the prince is essentially a giant bundle of insecurity.
A sudden, sharp, metallic clicking sounds as Fabian sets down his tea and reveals there is a way to force a congressional meeting.
Fabian suggests the prince should become the emperor's proxy, explaining that if his father passes away, the proxy naturally ascends to the throne. The prince looks on with a sinister, wide-eyed grin as Fabian explains that, as proxy, he could convene Congress himself. The prince asks if his father's death is even possible, and Fabian confirms the plan is moving forward while promising the support of other dukes. Noticing Fabian's confident smile, the prince feels more at ease with their treacherous path. Shifting the conversation, Fabian asks the prince if he has a cousin. Fabian inquires if the cousin is married, to which the prince replies that she is not. Fabian mentions that several high-ranking sons are single, specifically asking if the prince is familiar with Baron Turmoil. Fabian politely declines the prince's matchmaking suggestion, noting that while his cousin isn't married, she is already engaged to someone else. Fabian argues that he must keep even small promises like an engagement if he is to serve the future emperor in grander schemes. The prince sits comfortably, satisfied with Fabian's display of loyalty and principle. The prince admits this conviction is why he trusts Fabian, while the man bows modestly in return. Internally, Fabian's expression turns murderous as he curses the girl for not obediently marrying as she was told. With a dark, threatening gaze, Fabian vows to break the girl's legs if she continues to make things difficult for him. The scene shifts to the bright, ornate interior of the palace office. Brian sits at a massive wooden desk, looking tiny and overwhelmed by the towering stacks of documents surrounding him. Looking quite dazed, the boy admits to himself that he was genuinely moved by the Duke's recent actions. Brian recalls how the Duke protectively held him and even leveled buildings to ensure his safety. The boy rests his chin on his hand, lost in thought about his debt of gratitude. A heavy rhythmic thudding sounds as more paperwork is added to the already impossible piles on Brian's desk. Brian wails in despair, deeply regretting his decision to butt in and take on so much responsibility. A narrative box reveals that the current situation began about 2 hours ago. Brian bows low before the Duke, expressing his profound gratitude for being rescued from the pirates. The Duke's desk is covered in maps and reports as the two discuss the future. Brian declares he will be loyal for life, but quickly scales it back to being loyal for now, prompting the Duke to ask for specifics. Brian enthusiastically proposes improving the slums, helping vagrants and working women, and leading the entire reconstruction of Fair Street. Ulrich listens intently, summarizing that this leads them to the present situation. The Duke officially puts Brian in charge of all reconstruction efforts for Fair Street, delighting the ambitious boy. Back in the present, Brian looks like a ghost of his former self, exhausted from the endless administrative work. A worker approaches Brian with a scroll, complaining that the measurements for the project seem completely incorrect. An orange-haired worker rushes in to report duplicated names with conflicting numbers, while Brian desperately tries to finish his current page. Another man bursts in shouting about a big problem, explaining that the construction company has halted material deliveries due to lack of payment. Surrounded by demanding workers and urgent requests to see the Duke, Brian looks like he is about to snap. A sudden, sharp cracking sounds as Brian's patience finally breaks when a worker calls him milk cake and demands his attention.
A loud, sharp "ah" sounds as Brian snaps at the workers, ordering them to stop calling him milk cake while one of them notes the boy's sudden fury.
Looking completely drained of life, Brian asks Ulrich to repeat whatever he just said. Sitting with authority, Ulrich tells the boy that his personal training begins today. Brian questions the nature of the training, and the Duke explains that he must learn self-defense to protect himself from future threats.
A bright, loud ha 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 sounds as Brian bursts into hysterical laughter at the thought of adding training to his schedule.
Pointing to his dark circles, Brian asks the Duke if he can even see the terrible, exhausted state he is currently in. Ulrich maintains a perfectly calm expression and simply confirms that he can see exactly how the boy looks. A sudden, sharp kya sounds as Brian argues he'll die from overwork rather than a bullet, but Ulrich counters that a stray bullet will kill him first. Brian asks if the Duke really expects him to get shot again, and Ulrich warns him that danger is a constant, unpredictable presence.
The Duke asserts that self-defense is mandatory because Brian will be staying by his side for the rest of his life, leaving the boy utterly baffled.
Brian's face goes pale with shock as the weight of a lifelong appointment sinks in. A sudden, sharp wah sounds as Brian recoils in mental agony, screaming at the prospect of being tied to this job forever.
A quiet moment of transition passes as the story prepares for the next phase of their discussion. A loud, desperate kia sounds as Brian realizes the Duke intends to work him to death as a permanent butler.
Regaining his composure, Brian states that he won't feel safe until every single pirate gang is captured and brought to justice.
Ulrich suggests staying close to him as the safest option, causing Brian to realize the Duke is genuinely worried about his well-being.
Brian glares and suggests there is a much more efficient way to handle protection, catching the Duke off guard.
A sudden, quick tia sounds as Brian suggests interrogating the remaining pirates, imagining himself as a devil cutting a rope to drop a pirate to the sharks. Brian points out that the pirate underlings likely know nothing, and he scolds the Duke for killing the captain instead of simply wounding him for questioning.
Warning that they need to find the link to the Western continent nations, Brian faces a Duke whose aura has turned dark and intense.
Ulrich asks how Brian identified the item's origin, and the boy explains he recognized the patterns from previous drawings he had seen.
Brian explains he saw the designs at a modern ship exhibition, leading the Duke to praise the boy's truly remarkable intellect. Ulrich asks what Brian expects to find from the fence, and the boy reacts with exasperated disbelief at the Duke's lack of foresight.
Examining a map, Brian explains they must uncover the relationship between the Pirate Federation and the 3 Western continent nations.
Brian notes that these two forces were once bitter enemies, so their current cooperation implies they have found a common goal.
Pointing directly at Ulrich, Brian declares that the Duke himself is the common enemy they are both targeting.
Brian explains that the Duke's reputation as the undefeated Blue Wave makes him the primary obstacle for their expansion.
The boy emphasizes that Ulrich is the shared target that has brought the rival factions together.
Brian warns that the territory will remain in constant danger until this geopolitical issue is resolved.
Ulrich looks thoughtful and eventually agrees to follow Brian's lead and proceed as he suggests.
Brian feels a wave of relief, realizing that since the Duke is now worried about his own safety, the training will likely be canceled. Looking intensely at the boy, Ulrich thinks to himself that he absolutely cannot leave Brian in any kind of danger.
A narrative box reveals the Duke's internal vow to use this opportunity to eliminate every single threat to Brian.
Brian walks cheerfully down the long palace corridor, feeling accomplished after his meeting with the Duke.
The boy's smile fades as he suddenly encounters a tall man with long, dark hair.
The man is revealed to be the prince, dressed in a formal purple and white outfit. The prince offers a polite greeting and remarks that Brian appears to be faring much better than he expected. Brian looks puzzled as the prince notes that the atmosphere of the castle has changed significantly since his last visit.
With a charming smile, the prince tells Brian that the castle's transformation from tacky to bright is clearly thanks to him.
Brian bows respectfully and insists that he hasn't done anything special to deserve such high praise. The prince mentions that Princess Isabel loved her gift, but Brian quickly clarifies that the Duke was the one who personally selected the earrings. The prince is visibly surprised, questioning if his uncle Ulrich really made the choice himself. A bright, warm ha-ha sounds as Brian laughs, explaining that the Duke actually struggled and deliberated for a very long time. The prince offers a faint, mysterious smile as he listens to Brian's description of the Duke's efforts. The prince dismisses Brian so he can return to his duties, and the boy politely takes his leave.
Brian walks past the prince, maintaining a respectful and humble demeanor.
A soft, quick whoo sounds as Brian exhales, feeling as though the prince was probing him with his eyes, despite the friendly smile.
Brian concludes that there is something deeply uncomfortable about the way the prince observes people.
The dark-haired prince remains standing in the hallway, looking ahead with a steady, unreadable expression.
Sunlight streams through a palace window, ending the scene with a view of the clear blue sky. The rhythmic scratching of a pen sounds as Duke Ulrich works diligently at his desk. A man with long, dark hair enters the room, smiling brightly and calling out to his uncle. Looking visibly annoyed, Ulrich immediately tells the visitor to get out of his sight. The dark-haired man remains standing there, watching the Duke continue his administrative duties. The visitor brings up the topic of the deputy butler, causing the Duke to pause mid-sentence. With a knowing look, the prince remarks that the Duke seems quite fond of the boy. The prince recalls how the Duke leveled an entire city just to rescue the young deputy butler. The prince questions if Brian is being pushed too hard with his current workload. Maintaining his focus on the paperwork, the Duke bluntly tells the prince to leave again. The prince warns that Brian is on the verge of collapsing from overwork at this rate.
A vision of a small, pale, and trembling Brian appears, drowning in a sea of documents.
The prince mentions his plan to teach the boy self-defense, causing the Duke to scoff internally. The Duke asks what information he was supposed to find regarding a specific engine. Ulrich suggests that Viscount Liedre is the one who has been supporting the relevant scholars. A shadowy figure is ordered to spy on the Duke's movements and the engine's performance. The prince admires how sharp his uncle's battlefield instincts remain even in a palace setting. With a confident smile, the dark-haired prince declares that he will handle the matter himself. The Duke calls the prince a little devil for his schemes, but the man remains unfazed. Noticing the Duke's sudden change in demeanor, the prince asks why he is in such a bad mood. The Duke asks for advice on what to do when a student refuses to be taught. The prince points out that Brian likely doesn't have a single moment to spare for training. A sudden, sharp crack sounds as the Duke's aura turns murderous while he denies mentioning Brian. The prince suggests that the best way to handle a reluctant student is to use allure. The Duke falls into deep thought, his eyes narrowing as he considers the prince's advice. A narrative bubble reveals the Duke is trying to remember what things Brian actually likes. He recalls a moment where Brian looked at a fine sword with sparkling, adoring eyes. A soft, pleasant hoo-hoo sounds as the Duke smiles to himself, having formulated a plan.
Ulrich looks directly at the prince and asks if he knows what specifically Brian likes.
Getting close to the prince's face, the Duke issues a dark warning not to target the boy. The Duke points an accusing finger, stating he won't tolerate any attempts to lure Brian away.
With a stern expression, Ulrich warns the prince to stop showing any interest in his deputy butler.
The Duke turns his back on the prince and begins walking away with long, determined strides.
A loud, sharp slam sounds as the Duke exits the room, leaving the prince behind.
A soft, quick pew sounds as the prince wonders how such a clever man can be so oblivious. The Duke walks down the hallway, radiating a serene and almost flowery aura of satisfaction.
The scene shifts to the bright harbor area where Brian is talking with a tall merchant.
A loud, booming humph sounds as the merchant suggests lowering the tax on essential goods.
Brian looks the man in the eye and explains that he doesn't have the authority to change taxes. The merchant accuses him of being wasteful, but Brian retorts that there are many urgent expenses. The merchant remarks on how smart and ruthless young people are becoming in business. A heavy, tired sigh sounds as the merchant complains about the lack of workers for his project. Brian's attention is suddenly drawn away by an unexpected sight on the docks. He watches as a group of prisoners in chains are led along the harbor by a sailor. Brian realizes these are the pirates in the fence he had encountered during his ordeal. Brian runs toward a sailor named Uncle Pio, asking where the prisoners are being taken. A quick, sharp slit sounds as Uncle Pio makes a gesture indicating the pirates are to be executed. Brian is shocked to learn the Duke ordered them to be hung on hooks to die slowly. Brian stops the procession, shouting that they cannot be killed, much to the pirates' relief. He argues that it is a waste of resources to kill healthy, able-bodied workers who can talk. Brian declares that the pirates should be worked until they drop dead since there is a labor shortage. Brian bursts into the Duke's office, shouting that he must speak with him immediately. The blonde Duke calmly sips his tea while the boy watches him with an unimpressed, flat expression. Brian requests to cancel the pirates' hook punishment, prompting the Duke to ask if he has a better alternative. Brian explains his philosophy that most problems stem from a lack of money, leaving the Duke confused. Brian points out that the current population of the territory is insufficient to solve its mounting problems. The Duke's eye twitches in a moment of visible irritation. The Duke defends his vast wealth as sufficient, while Brian mockingly acknowledges his employer's overflowing riches. A sudden, sharp poof sounds as the Duke spits out his tea when Brian argues the territory lacks culture. The Duke expresses concern that the pirates are too unruly to be integrated as productive workers. A sudden, hard pock sounds as Brian smacks his fist into his palm to signal his determination. Brian deviously suggests working the prisoners to exhaustion for several days to drain away their aggressive spirits. Blood drips from the Duke's mouth as he reacts in shock to the boy's cold-blooded efficiency. A rhythmic, sharp jock sounds as the Duke claps and declares Brian an exceptional talent for the territory. Brian bows respectfully, claiming to be honored by the Duke's excessive and unexpected praise. Brian pauses the conversation to mention he has one final, serious question for his employer. Brian asks for the interrogation results, catching the Duke off guard as he wipes his face.
The Duke reports on the pirate alliance, surprising Brian with his willingness to share high-level strategic information.
The Duke asks Brian for his opinion on a mysterious drawing of a long-distance communication device.
Brian reflects on how he originally intended to make the Duke do all the work himself.
The Duke expresses his suspicion that a traitorous insider exists somewhere within the Empire's ranks.
Brian analyzes the pirates' long-term planning, concluding that they must have a high-level collaborator.
The Duke agrees with the boy's sharp analysis and confirms that an official investigation is required.
Noticing Brian's interest, the Duke remarks on the boy's extensive knowledge regarding various weapons.
The Duke asks Brian if he would enjoy having his own personal gun to observe every day.
The Duke offers to personally teach Brian shooting for self-defense, leaving the boy completely stunned.
A heavy, expectant silence fills the room as the two stare at each other.
Brian is overwhelmed with excitement at the thought of owning a gun and receiving professional lessons.
Brian imagines himself in a military uniform, holding a gleaming revolver with perfect, deadly posture.
A close-up view shows Brian's steady hand aiming the golden revolver toward an unseen target. Brian blushes intensely, his face lighting up with pure, unadulterated joy and affection.
The Duke watches with a satisfied smirk, realizing his lure has successfully trapped the boy's interest.
Brian eagerly confirms his interest, shouting his agreement with a bright and determined face.
Brian leans in close, excitedly begging the Duke to start his shooting lessons immediately.
Gloved hands tremble while holding a wanted poster for Brienne, offering a massive 20 million gold reward.
A man with glasses looks severely stressed and enraged while staring down at the flyer.
The man with glasses questions if the daughter of Blair Marquis was the one who distributed the posters.
They recall Brienne's role as a companion and her dangerous ability to effortlessly win people's favor.
The man finds it suspicious that a high noble would resort to flyers to locate a missing companion.
The man with glasses crumples the wanted poster in a fit of seething, envious rage.
The subordinate suggests that Brienne's charm is a genetic trait inherited from the Oten family bloodline.
The man with glasses stares ahead with a cold, murderous intensity in his eyes.
Terrified by the man's aura, the subordinate stammers an apology for his rambling.
A heavy, tired "ha" sounds as the man dismisses the nonsense and orders the subordinate to find Brienne.
The subordinate pauses, stating that he has one final, urgent matter to report to his superior.
The subordinate reveals the shocking news that their western base has been completely wiped out.
The official is stunned to learn that Duke Connart personally led the assault that destroyed their base.
Looking at the chandelier above, the man wonders if the Duke has discovered their secret plans.
The man is horrified that the Duke razed an entire street just to rescue one deputy butler.
The subordinate reports that the butler is exceptionally capable, earning the respect of everyone around him.
The man with glasses notes the butler came from the capital and arrived 4 months ago. Baron Oten ponders someone's vast knowledge of Imperial naval history and weaponry.
With a chilling grin, the man with glasses recalls the suspect's brown hair and eyes.
Baron Oten bursts into a fit of maniacal laughter while his subordinate watches silently. He realizes with growing amusement that Brienne has been hiding right under their noses.
He is astounded by the realization that the girl successfully disguised herself as a man.
He concludes that she laundered her identity to become a deputy butler for Duke Connart.
He imagines her delight at meeting a legendary figure of naval history like the Duke.
Baron Oten asks his subordinate for absolute confirmation that the butler is indeed Brienne.
The subordinate admits he was unable to obtain a clear sketch of the butler's face.
Baron Oten contemplates the necessity of verifying the butler's identity in person.
He laments the lack of a plausible excuse to meet someone of Duke Connart's status.
A sudden, sharp tap-tap sounds as the man's thoughts are interrupted.
A servant reports a visitor's arrival, earning a sharp rebuke from the annoyed Baron.
A massive man bursts into the room with a sudden, powerful foosh sounding.
The large man bellows for Baron Oten while the Baron expresses his irritation.
Baron Oten offers a forced greeting to his unexpected guest, Viscount Varen.
Viscount Varen demands to know the current location of his fiancée, Brienne.
Baron Oten lies about Brienne's improved health to pacify the aggressive Viscount. He claims she went south for recuperation, prompting Varen to plan an immediate trip.
Baron Oten warns that she is already traveling to Connart territory to visit her hometown.
He explains that the territory holds deep sentimental value for their family. He claims she wants one last visit before marriage, causing the Viscount to worry.
Baron Oten smirks inwardly as the Viscount resolves to go to Connart territory himself.
He plots to use the Viscount's visit as a way to force Brienne into the open.
Baron Oten feigns concern for the trouble cost, but the Viscount dismisses it as life.
With a devious smirk, Baron Oten leads the unwitting Viscount out of the room.
Brian carries a heavy stack of papers complaining about his mountain of never-ending work. Brian's attention is caught by a sudden shout calling him a silly nickname. He looks up to find Sir Roik leaning out of a nearby wingar.
Brian angrily forbids the use of the nickname and issues a formal demerit point.
He threatens to record the slight in his diary and curse the knight's name daily.
Sir Roik laughs at the threat, mockingly claiming to be terrified of the boy.
Brian is annoyed that his target isn't showing even the slightest hint of fear. Brian stares at the knight with a flat, judgmental expression while holding his documents.
Sir Roik notices the boy's dark mood and asks why he looks so troubled.
Brian asks if the knight is pining for a girl at the barbershop, causing extreme embarrassment.
Brian remarks that the knight's crush on Miss Rosie is common knowledge to everyone.
He bluntly states that everyone except toddlers is aware of the knight's feelings.
Brian reveals that Miss Rosie is actually seeing someone else, completely devastating Sir Roik.
Brian insults the knight's messy hair while Roik stands paralyzed by his sudden heartbreak.
A loud, sobbing ooh-ah sounds as Sir Roik breaks down in the hallway.
A sudden, gentle pat-pat sounds as Brian offers to cut the knight's hair.
As they walk away, Brian casually remarks on the mortality of those who lose their heads.
The Duke sits at his desk and calls out to his knightly subordinate.
Sir Roik presents his newly shaved head, prompting a mocking comment from the Duke.
The Duke is surprised to learn that Brian was the one who cut the hair.
Roik explains that Brian didn't really cut it so much as shave it all off. The Duke notes that the new look actually suits him, surprising the knight.
The Duke realizes that many others have been seeking Brian out for haircuts.
He briefly wonders if Brian has any free time before concluding that he likely doesn't. The Duke recalls his employer's claim that he is far too busy for even basic self-care.
A heavy, thoughtful silence fills the room as the Duke considers the boy's punishing work schedule. Brian stands frozen with haircutting tools, looking completely overwhelmed by the Duke's sudden request.
The scene shifts as the Duke sits patiently in a chair while Brian prepares to begin the haircut.
Brian skeptically asks if the Duke is truly serious about allowing him to cut his hair.
The Duke firmly confirms his intent while focusing on his own reflection in the mirror. The Duke closes his eyes, patiently waiting for the boy to begin the task.
The Duke notes his hair doesn't need a total reset like Roiki's, but Brian retorts that he'd rather reset the Duke's personality.
Brian carefully reaches out to examine the texture of the Duke's gleaming golden hair.
Brian is visibly impressed, remarking on how surprisingly soft the Duke's hair feels to the touch.
Brian explains that soft hair lacks the strength needed for easy shaping and warns that it will take time.
Looking toward the bright window, Brian's voice drifts through the room, telling the Duke to be patient. Brian leans in close, meticulously trimming the hair at the nape of the Duke's neck.
A sudden, sharp snip sounds as Brian works with intense focus and professional precision.
The Duke remains perfectly still, his eyes closed in a moment of rare, quiet tranquility.
Brian's fingers graze the Duke's skin as he carefully adjusts the hair around his ears.
The Duke flinches slightly as he begins to feel an unexpected wave of heat from the close contact. Gentle taps follow as Brian uses a small tool to clear away the cut hair from the Duke's neck.
A soft, breathy "hoo" sounds as Brian blows on the Duke's skin, causing the man's neck to flush red.
The Duke shuts his eyes tight, visibly sweating from the intimate and ticklish sensation against his skin. Another soft breath brushes against the Duke's neck as Brian continues to clear the area meticulously.
Beads of sweat roll down the Duke's face while he struggles to maintain his composure during the process.
The Duke abruptly snaps his head around, questioning if the boy hasn't done enough work already. Both men freeze in a moment of intense proximity, staring directly into each other's eyes.
A heavy, expectant silence hangs in the air as they remain locked in a close and awkward gaze.
The Duke's expression softens slightly as he continues to stare at the boy's surprised and flushed face.
Sunlight glimmers around the Duke's golden hair as the tension between the two continues to build.
A rhythmic, heavy thumping sounds as Brian's heart begins to race while his face lights up with a blush. Brian's face turns a deep, beet-red color from the overwhelming closeness and the heat of the moment. Brian frantically pulls the cutting cloth away, shouting that he has finally finished his greatest masterpiece.
A weary, long phew sounds as Brian tells the Duke to check the mirror for his perfect results.
Brian clasps his hands in delight, eagerly awaiting his employer's praise for the new hairstyle. Brian's excitement instantly vanishes into a flat, deadpan expression when he realizes nothing has actually changed.
The Duke bluntly asks what was even changed, while Brian insists he focused on tiny, essential details.
Brian passionately argues that he used all his concentration to fix the Duke's unruly bangs and spiky hair.
Brian slumps his shoulders in exhaustion, realizing his hard work went completely unappreciated by the Duke.
The Duke reaches out and places a steady, comforting hand on top of the boy's head. A warm aura surrounds them as the Duke gently pats Brian to soothe his frustration and disappointment.
The Duke warns Brian that his position is for life, threatening to use his power if Brian ever leaves. Brian dismisses the threat with a huff, confirming he has no intention of leaving his life at Connacht.
Brian quickly pivots back to his main interest, asking when the promised shooting lessons will finally begin.
The scene shifts abruptly to the grand and imposing architecture of the Palais Royal Academy.
Inside a lavish room, a dark-haired girl named Becca sits at her desk writing a letter intently.
A visitor asks for permission to enter, and Becca warmly welcomes her inside without looking up.
A silver-haired girl steps through the door, curious about the letter Becca is focusing on so intently. Becca explains that she is currently writing a secret letter to her brother to stay in touch.
The silver-haired girl clarifies if the recipient is Prince Cyrn, and Becca confirms his royal identity.
Noticing the strange script, the girl asks if the prince can read the ancient language Becca is using.
Becca explains that while her brother can read the ancient script, he is unfortunately unable to write it.
A sudden fluttering froosh sounds as a messenger bird takes flight to deliver Becca's secret message.
Becca finishes her letter with a look of calm determination. She instructs her messenger bird, Luel, to carry the letter to her brother. A sudden fluttering foosh sounds as Bika releases the bird into the open sky.
Becca rests her chin on her hand, looking thoughtfully out the window. She notes the gathering dark clouds, seeing them as a reflection of the Empire's future.
She gazes at the horizon, sensing a brutal and dark path ahead for the nation.
Brian reminds the Duke of his promise to provide shooting lessons.
Brian questions the choice of such a dangerous location for their training session. Brian stands awkwardly on the rocky cliffside, looking completely out of his element. The Duke explains that combat training must be as intense as a real battle to be effective. Brian protests that he only wanted to learn to shoot, not experience a life-or-death struggle.
The Duke warns that a deputy butler is in danger regardless of whether they are armed.
He tells Brian to abandon his obsession with weapons if he cannot endure the training. The Duke lists the privileges Brian will lose, including access to his ships if he quits. A soft pop sounds as a devilish inner voice urges Brian to quit before he collapses. Another soft pop sounds as an angelic inner voice reminds him of his lifelong love for weapons.
Brian's internal meter for determination surges to a full 100%.
A loud rushing splash sounds as Brian shouts his resolve to work as hard as possible. The Duke begins the lesson by giving Brian specific instructions on his physical posture. He emphasizes that the core is the most vital element of handling any weapon effectively.
Brian's legs shake violently as he struggles to maintain the punishing training stance.
The Duke encourages him to embrace the trembling, but Brian feels he has reached his limit.
A sudden sharp huh sounds as Brian unexpectedly loses his balance on the rocks. Brian tumbles backward, falling off the cliff edge and toward the sea below.
In a panic, Brian cries out for the Duke to catch him before he falls. Brian plunges through the air, looking down at the churning water in terror.
Brian realizes that falling into the Duke's arms would be an even greater danger than the fall.
He fears that physical contact will reveal the truth of his identity to the Duke. The Duke reaches out desperately to save the boy from his dangerous descent. Brian frantically decides that he must avoid the Duke's embrace at any cost. Brian uses his momentum to dive away from the Duke and toward the water. The Duke is left staring in utter confusion as Brian deliberately avoids being saved. Brian focuses his will, choosing the impact of the waves over the risk of discovery. A massive booming splash sounds as Brian hits the surface of the sea.
A wet, coughing splutter sounds as Brian surfaces and spits out a mouthful of seawater.
A sharp, startled huck sounds as Brian looks back to see the Duke nearby.
The Duke asks why the boy would choose to jump into the sea instead of being caught. The Duke pulls Brian into his arms, holding him securely amidst the rolling waves.
Brian is struck by the intense and uncharacteristically worried expression on the Duke's face. He wonders if the man's concern for him goes deeper than a simple master-servant bond.
A heavy silence hangs between them as they float together in the cold water.
Brian laments the chaotic turn his simple request for shooting lessons has taken.
The Duke's hand settles firmly on Brian's back, pressing against the bandages beneath his clothes. Brian gasps as he realizes the Duke has finally felt the truth through the contact. The Duke whispers Brian's full name, his voice filled with a sudden, dawning realization. The Duke looks down at the person in his arms with an expression of pure, unadulterated shock. A profound silence fills the air as the Duke stares at Brian, the secret finally laid bare.